He thought she had ruined his toast, but the poor maid had just saved his life. Grace Bennett's hands trembled as she crossed the marble floor of the Callahan mansion, a silver tray of champagne balanced against her palm, the crystal glasses glowing beneath the gold light of 3 chandeliers. Around her, Chicago's richest people laughed softly over imported cheeses, tailored suits, silk gowns, and business deals spoken like prayers. To them, Grace was part of the furniture, a quiet black maid in a pressed uniform and worn black shoes, moving carefully through a world that had never once opened a door for women like her. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to Grace Bennett, who had already learned that survival sometimes meant keeping your eyes low and your voice lower. But that night, as she stepped toward Vincent Callahan, the most feared man in the city, her eyes lifted for one impossible second. Not to his face, not to the black suit that fit him like power itself, not to the quiet men standing behind him with their hands folded and their expressions unreadable. Grace looked at his glass. A thin white film curled at the bottom of the champagne flute, dissolving in the bubbles like a secret trying to disappear. Her breath caught. She had seen something like that before, not in mansions, not under chandeliers, but in a hospital room where her younger brother Marcus had nearly stopped breathing after a nurse discovered the wrong medication in his water cup. Grace knew that color. She knew that strange, cloudy swirl. And in the space of one heartbeat, she understood that if Vincent Callahan raised that glass to his mouth, something terrible would happen in front of everyone. The toast had already begun. Madison Whitmore, blonde, polished, and smiling with the confidence of a woman who had never been told no, lifted her glass beside Vincent and turned toward the room. Her father, Bradley Whitmore, stood near the bar, his silver cuff links catching the light. He was smiling too, but Grace noticed his eyes were not on Madison. They were on Vincent's hand. Vincent raised the champagne. Grace moved before fear could stop her. The tray tilted. A woman gasped. Someone said her name sharply, but Grace was already there. She reached out and knocked the glass from Vincent Callahan's hand. Champagne exploded across the marble floor. Crystal shattered at his feet. The music seemed to vanish. For 1 second, every face in the room froze. Then Madison's voice cut through the silence, bright and cruel. "You stupid maid." A ripple of laughter moved through the guests, uncertain at first, then louder as they saw Grace standing there with her chest rising fast, her hands still outstretched, her whole body shaking beneath the weight of what she had done. Madison stepped closer, her smile hardening. This is what happens when desperate people are allowed into beautiful rooms. More laughter followed. Someone near the fireplace muttered that good help was impossible to find. Another guest looked at the spilled champagne and said it probably cost more than Grace made in a month. Grace heard every word, but she did not look at them. Her eyes stayed on the broken glass, on the faint white foam clinging to one jagged piece of crystal. Vincent Callahan did not move. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend her. He only looked down at the ruined toast, then at Grace, and something in his cold blue eyes changed. The room kept laughing, but the Mafia Boss had stopped breathing like a man who had just realized the poorest woman in the room might be the only one telling the truth. 3 months earlier, Grace Bennett had stood outside the service entrance of the Callahan mansion with a paper resume folded in her coat pocket and $7 in her checking account. The lake wind came hard off Lake Michigan that morning, sharp enough to cut through her thrift store jacket, but Grace did not step away from the iron gate. She had learned a long time ago that life did not open doors for people who looked tired. You had to stand there anyway. Behind the gate, the mansion rose like something from another country, gray stone walls, tall windows, black cars resting in the curved driveway, and security cameras watching every breath she took. Grace knew the name Callahan. Everybody in Chicago did. People said Vincent Callahan owned half the restaurants downtown, 3 private clubs on the Gold Coast, and enough silent influence to make powerful men answer his calls before the second ring. Some called him a businessman. Some called him something darker. Grace did not care what they called him. She cared about the hospital bill folded beside her resume, the one with her brother Marcus's name printed at the top in cold blue ink. Marcus was 22, too young to sound that tired when he called her from his hospital bed, too young to apologize for needing medication that cost more than their rent. Grace had been cleaning rooms at a hotel near O'Hare Airport until the week she reported a wealthy guest for humiliating a housekeeper in the hallway. The manager told her she had done the right thing, then quietly removed her from the schedule. After that, every application felt like dropping a stone into Lake Michigan and waiting for it to float back. The Callahan job came through a staffing agency that warned her about discretion before it mentioned pay. No personal questions. No photographs. No speaking to guests unless spoken to. No entering the West Wing after 9 o'clock at night. Grace signed every page because the hourly rate was 3 times what she had made at the hotel, and because Marcus needed a specialist before the end of the month. Inside the mansion, Mrs. Helen Porter, the head housekeeper, looked her over with kind but tired eyes. She told Grace that staff members survived in that house by becoming invisible. Grace almost smiled. She had been practicing invisibility her entire life. In school, when teachers mispronounced her name and moved on. In stores, when clerks followed her down aisles without asking whether she needed help. In waiting rooms, when nurses spoke over her as if she was not the one holding the insurance papers. The mansion was just another room where people with money expected her to shrink. So Grace worked. She polished silver until her wrists ached. She carried laundry down marble staircases wider than her apartment. She learned which guests liked bourbon, which wives pretended not to see their husbands staring, and which men laughed the loudest when someone beneath them was embarrassed. She saw Vincent Callahan only from a distance during those first weeks, a tall white man in dark suits, moving through his own house like silence had been trained to obey him. He never shouted. He never wasted words. That made people fear him more. Grace kept her head down whenever he passed, not because she thought she was less than him, but because she had too much to lose. Every Friday, she sent most of her paycheck to the hospital and kept just enough for bus fare, groceries, and Marcus's favorite lemon candy from the corner store. Each night, she told herself the same thing while folding her uniform over the back of a chair in her small South Side apartment. Keep quiet. Do the work. Save your brother. But Grace had not come from weak people. Her mother had scrubbed offices for 30 years and still taught her children to stand straight. Her grandmother used to say that humility did not mean letting people step on your soul. Grace carried those words under her uniform like a hidden flame. She could survive being ignored. She could survive being underestimated. What she could not survive was watching harm happen in front of her and pretending she had not seen it. That was why, 3 months later, under those chandeliers, with champagne on the marble and laughter rising around her like smoke, Grace already knew the price of speaking up. She had paid it before, and she was about to pay it again. By the night of the Whitmore celebration, Grace had learned every rhythm of the Callahan mansion. She knew the chandeliers were dimmed by 6:30, the first black cars arrived by 7, and the kitchen doors would swing open every 12 seconds once the dinner service began. She knew Mrs. Porter would check every napkin crease twice, that the violinist in the corner always tuned too sharply, and that guests with old money spoke quietly while guests with new money made sure everyone heard them. That evening, the house looked less like a home and more like a stage built for power. White roses climbed the banisters. Gold-rimmed plates lined the dining table like small moons. Crystal glasses waited beneath candlelight, clean enough to reflect every smile in the room. The celebration was supposed to honor a major business agreement between Vincent Callahan and the Whitmore family, a deal people whispered could reshape half of Chicago's luxury hotel market. Madison Whitmore moved through the crowd as if the mansion already belonged to her, laughing with her friends, touching the diamond necklace at her throat, calling staff members by the wrong names because she could not be bothered to learn the right ones. Her father, Bradley Whitmore, wore a navy suit and the kind of smile that made every sentence feel like a contract. He shook Vincent's hand near the fireplace, while photographers captured the moment for society pages that never printed the truth behind rich men's eyes. Grace carried appetizers past them, invisible by design, but not blind. She saw Madison glance at her uniform and whisper something to a red-haired woman in silver heels. The woman laughed into her champagne. 5 minutes later, Madison lifted an empty glass from Grace's tray and said, "Make sure this one comes back clean, sweetheart. Fingerprints show on crystal." Grace nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Another woman leaned close enough for Grace to smell gardenia perfume and asked, "Do they teach you girls how to serve champagne?" Or do you just learn on the bus? The group laughed softly, careful enough not to disturb the music, but loud enough for Grace to hear. Grace kept walking. Her shoes pinched at the heel, and the hospital receipt in her pocket scratched against her thigh every time she moved. She thought of Marcus lying 6 miles away under fluorescent lights, trying to sound cheerful whenever she called. So she swallowed her pride and carried the tray higher. Near the bar, Bradley Whitmore stood alone for a moment, his back half turned toward the room. Grace saw his hand move over a champagne flute waiting on the service table. It was quick, almost graceful, the kind of motion a careless person would miss. Something small slipped from his fingers and vanished into the drink. Grace slowed. Bradley looked up. Their eyes met for less than a second. His smile did not change, but his face became colder. "Problem?" he asked. Grace lowered her gaze. "No, sir." She wanted to believe she had imagined it. In houses like this, imagining things could cost you your job. But then the champagne in the glass clouded faintly, just once, a pale swirl twisting beneath the bubbles before dissolving. Grace's stomach tightened. Across the room, Madison tapped a spoon against her glass, calling everyone to attention. Vincent Callahan stepped beside her, calm and unreadable, accepting the flute Bradley handed him with practiced ease. The room gathered around the toast, silk dresses brushing against dark suits, laughter fading into expectation. Grace stood near the edge of the crowd, her fingers locked around the tray, her pulse counting down each second. "Keep quiet," she told herself. "Do the work. Save your brother." But her grandmother's voice rose beneath that fear, steady as Sunday morning. "Humility does not mean letting people step on your soul." Vincent lifted the glass. Bradley watched. Madison smiled. And Grace Bennett moved. Grace reached Vincent just as the rim of the champagne flute touched the shadow below his mouth. Her hand came up fast, not graceful, not trained, not proper for a maid in a room full of important people, but fast enough. The glass flew from Vincent Callahan's fingers and struck the marble with a sharp, ringing crack that seemed to split the music in half. Champagne spread across the floor in a pale gold sheet. Crystals scattered near Vincent's polished shoes. For one breath, nobody moved. The violinist stopped mid-note. Madison's smile froze. Bradley Whitmore's hand tightened around his own glass. Grace stood in front of the most powerful man in Chicago with her arms still raised, her chest rising and falling, her face hot with terror. She knew what it looked like. A poor maid interrupting a toast. A black woman in a servant's uniform touching the glass of a white man everyone feared. In another world, maybe someone would have asked why. In this room, they only saw permission to laugh. Madison stepped forward first, her heels clicking against the marble like a judge's gavel. "You stupid maid," she said, each word polished and cruel. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Grace opened her mouth, but nothing came out quickly enough. The room began to murmur. A man near the fireplace chuckled. A woman covered her smile with 2 fingers, pretending embarrassment while enjoying every second. Madison looked around, sensing the audience, and her voice rose just enough to carry. This is what happens when desperate people are allowed into beautiful rooms. They panic. They break things. They forget where they are. Laughter rippled through the guests. It was not loud at first. It was worse than loud. It was elegant, controlled, the kind of laughter people use when they want cruelty to sound like manners. Grace lowered her hand. Her fingers shook so badly she folded them into her apron. "Ma'am," she said, forcing the word through a dry throat. There was something in the glass. Madison blinked, then laughed once, sharp and bright. "Something in the glass?" She turned toward the crowd. Did everyone hear that? Now she is a chemist. A few guests laughed harder. Bradley moved smoothly into the circle, his expression arranged into wounded concern. "Mr. Callahan," he said, his voice calm enough to sound reasonable. "I believe your employee may be overwhelmed. These events can be intimidating for people who are not used to this environment." Grace looked at him then. For one second, fear and certainty collided inside her. He had done it. She knew he had done it. But he stood there in his expensive suit, surrounded by witnesses who would believe his shoes before they believed her eyes. "I saw you," Grace said quietly. The words landed with the weight of a glass dropped in church. Bradley's smile faded only at the edges. "Excuse me." Grace swallowed. Her voice trembled, but it did not disappear. "Near the bar. You put something in his drink." The room changed, not into belief, into entertainment. Madison threw her head back and laughed as if Grace had just performed for them. That is enough. First she ruins a toast, now she accuses my father. Vincent, surely you are not going to let your maid turn this evening into a circus. The word maid struck harder than any insult before it, not because it was false, but because of how Madison used it, like a stain, like a cage, like the whole of Grace's life could be reduced to a uniform and a paycheck. Someone whispered that she was probably trying to get attention. Another guest said staff should be screened more carefully. Grace heard every sentence. She felt each one settle on her shoulders beside every old humiliation she had carried from hotel hallways, grocery aisles, hospital counters, and rooms where people looked through her until they needed someone to blame. Yet she did not step back. She looked down at the broken flute. A small piece of crystal near Vincent's shoe still held a trace of champagne, and along its edge, the faint white residue clung like a truth too stubborn to vanish. Please, Grace said, not to Madison, not to Bradley, but to Vincent. Do not drink anything from that table. The laughter thinned. Vincent Callahan had not spoken. He had not defended her. He had not condemned her. He only watched her with those cold blue eyes, still as winter over Lake Michigan. Then his gaze moved from Grace to the broken glass, from the broken glass to Bradley Whitmore, and finally to the crowd that had found a woman's fear amusing. The silence stretched so long that Madison's smile began to falter. Grace stood alone in the center of all that wealth, her uniform marked with spilled champagne, her dignity under attack, her job hanging by a thread. But for the first time that night, the laughter did not belong to the room anymore. It belonged to people who suddenly realized the man they wanted to impress was no longer laughing with them. Vincent Callahan let the silence breathe until it became heavier than the chandeliers above them. He had built his life on reading rooms, not words. Words were cheap. Rooms told the truth. A guilty man looked for exits before he looked for witnesses. A frightened man talked too much. A cruel crowd always glanced at power before deciding whether cruelty was still safe. Vincent saw all of it. He saw Madison's smile tighten at the corners. He saw Bradley Whitmore's thumb rub against the side of his glass in a nervous rhythm he probably did not know he had. He saw the guests who had laughed at Grace now pretending they had not laughed quite so loudly. And he saw Grace Bennett standing in the center of his marble floor with spilled champagne darkening the front of her black uniform, her shoulders drawn back even while every voice in the room tried to bend her. She looked terrified, yes, but not dishonest. That mattered. Vincent had met liars from every corner of Chicago, in boardrooms, restaurants, courtrooms, private clubs with velvet curtains and no windows. Liars performed confidence. Grace was not performing anything. She was shaking because she understood the cost of telling the truth to people who had already decided she was beneath them. Vincent lowered his eyes to the broken crystal near his shoe. The faint white residue clung to one sharp edge, pale against the gold champagne. A lesser man would have looked away to protect the evening. Vincent Callahan had not survived by protecting lies. No one leaves this room, he said. His voice was not loud, but it crossed the entire ballroom like cold air under a locked door. The front entrance closed. The two staff doors closed. The laughter died completely. Madison blinked. Vincent, surely you are not taking this seriously. He did not look at her. Mrs. Porter. The head housekeeper appeared near the side corridor, her face calm but pale. Yes, sir. Call Dr. Ellison. Tell him to bring a field test kit. Then have security save every camera angle from the bar, the service table, and the east side of the ballroom. Bradley gave a short, offended laugh. This is ridiculous. You are going to delay a multi-million-dollar agreement because a maid panicked. Vincent finally turned his head. I am going to delay it because she spoke, and you became afraid. The words struck the room so cleanly that nobody knew where to look. Grace looked down, not from shame, but because her eyes had filled too fast. No one had ever defended the sound of her voice before. Not like that. Not in a room where every person had more money, more influence, and more permission to be believed than she did. Madison stepped closer to Vincent, lowering her voice into something soft and polished for the audience. My father has known your family for years. She has worked here for what, a few months? You cannot let someone like her embarrass us. Something changed in Vincent's face then, so small most people missed it, but Grace saw it. The cold became personal. Someone like her, he repeated. Madison's lips parted, realizing too late that she had said the quiet part clearly enough for everyone to hear. Vincent looked at the guests one by one. Interesting. She may have saved my life, and your first concern is embarrassment. Nobody answered. Outside, beyond the tall windows, Lake Michigan was a black sheet under the city lights. Inside, the room felt smaller with every second. Dr. Ellison arrived 15 minutes later through the service entrance, still wearing his overcoat, a black medical bag in his hand. He was an older man with silver hair and the careful expression of someone used to being called into uncomfortable rooms. Vincent pointed to the broken glass. Test it. The doctor crouched beside the spilled champagne, collected a small sample with quiet precision, and opened a compact kit on the floor. Madison crossed her arms. Bradley stared at the fireplace. Grace could hear her own heartbeat over the faint hum of the heating vents. No one laughed now. No one called her stupid. No one asked whether she belonged in a beautiful room. They only watched the tiny test strip change color in Dr. Ellison's gloved hand. His face tightened. He looked up at Vincent, then at Grace, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Sir, he said carefully, Miss Bennett was right. For 3 full seconds after Dr. Ellison spoke, the ballroom became so quiet that Grace could hear the ice shifting in an untouched glass near the fireplace. The words did not echo. They landed. Miss Bennett was right. Not the maid. Not the girl. Not the help. Miss Bennett. Grace felt the name move through the room like a door opening. Madison's face lost its color first. Bradley Whitmore looked at the doctor as if the man had betrayed an agreement no one else could see. That is impossible, Bradley said, but his voice had thinned at the edges. There must be contamination from the floor, from the cleaning products, from anything. Dr. Ellison stood slowly, holding the test strip inside a sealed sleeve. The sample was collected from liquid still inside the fractured glass. The result is consistent with a foreign substance. I recommend preserving it for official testing. The guests shifted. Expensive fabric whispered against expensive fabric. People who had laughed at Grace now stared at the broken champagne flute as if it had become a mirror. Vincent did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Show the cameras. One of his security men stepped to the wall panel near the grand piano and connected a tablet to the large screen usually used for charity slideshows and family photographs. The screen flickered, then the ballroom appeared from above, bright and silent in black and white. Grace saw herself carrying appetizers. She saw Madison whispering behind her glass. She saw Bradley standing near the bar with his body angled away from the crowd. The video slowed. His hand moved over Vincent's champagne flute. A small pale object dropped into the drink. Nobody breathed. The footage played again, closer this time. Clearer. Bradley's smile remained on the screen while his fingers did what his mouth would later deny. Madison made a small sound. Not quite a gasp, not quite a protest. Vincent turned toward her. Did you know? Madison's eyes filled instantly, a polished kind of panic. Vincent, I had no idea. You cannot think I would ever be part of something like that. Grace watched her face and remembered the way Madison had stepped forward so quickly, the way she had not asked why Grace touched the glass, the way she had turned the room against her before anyone could think. Vincent seemed to remember it too. Play the east angle. The screen changed. This camera showed Madison beside her father 10 minutes before the toast. Bradley leaned close and whispered something. Madison's eyes moved to Grace, then to the service table, then back to her father. She nodded once. It was small. It was enough. The room seemed to shrink around her. Madison shook her head. That proves nothing. Vincent's voice remained calm. It proves you were watching the glass before Grace ever touched it. Grace felt her knees weaken, but she stayed standing. Mrs. Porter moved closer, not touching her, just near enough to make sure she was not alone. Bradley suddenly looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a man caught outside his own story. You are making a mistake, he said. We can discuss this privately. Vincent looked at him with a stillness that made even the candles seem to hold steady. You tried to use my home, my table, and a woman everyone here was willing to dismiss. He stepped beside Grace, not in front of her, not hiding her, but beside her. That was your mistake. The guests lowered their eyes. Madison's diamond necklace flashed under the chandelier, bright and useless. Bradley's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time that night, The people who had treated Grace like she did not belong finally understood that she had seen more clearly than all of them. And the most powerful man in the room had chosen to believe her. Vincent Callahan did not ask Bradley Whitmore to explain himself again. Explanations were for misunderstandings, and this was no misunderstanding. The screen behind them had already spoken in a language every powerful person in that room understood. Proof. Bradley's face hardened as he looked around for allies, but the same guests who had laughed so easily at Grace now found the floor fascinating. No one wanted to be seen standing beside him. No one wanted their name tied to the image frozen on the screen, his hand above Vincent's glass, his smile calm, his betrayal preserved in perfect light. Madison reached for Vincent's sleeve, but he stepped back before her fingers touched the fabric. "Do not," he said, softly enough that only the front half of the room heard it, but clearly enough for everyone to understand. Madison's hand fell. "Vincent, please. My father made a terrible mistake, but this does not have to destroy everything." Vincent looked at her then, and for the first time all night, there was no diplomacy left in his eyes. "You helped him choose a scapegoat." Madison flinched as if the word had weight. Grace stood very still beside Mrs. Porter, her damp uniform cold against her skin, her heart beating so hard she thought the room might hear it. Scapegoat. That was the word she had not dared to think. Not employee, not witness, not person. They had looked at her and seen someone disposable, someone poor enough to blame, black enough to doubt, quiet enough to disappear beneath the story they planned to tell. Vincent turned toward his attorney, a gray-haired woman named Evelyn Cross who had been standing near the far wall with her phone already in her hand. "Cancel the agreement." Evelyn nodded once. "Immediately. Freeze every pending transfer connected to Whitmore Holdings." Already in motion, Bradley's composure cracked. "You cannot do that based on one misunderstanding at a party." Vincent did not blink. "I can do it based on the morality clause you insisted on adding to the contract." A murmur moved through the room, sharp and hungry. Bradley's own cleverness had become a locked door with him on the wrong side. Evelyn glanced at her phone. "The clause allows immediate suspension in the event of conduct that creates reputational, legal, or operational risk." Vincent looked at Bradley. "Congratulations. You wrote it well." No one laughed. It would have been too dangerous, and perhaps too honest. Dr. Ellison sealed the sample. Security preserved the footage. A call was placed to the proper authorities, calm and documented, every word measured so no one could twist the night into rumor. Vincent did not threaten. He did not perform. He simply removed privilege from the people who had mistaken it for character. Madison's eyes filled with tears, but Grace noticed they came only after the money disappeared. "What about me?" Madison whispered. Vincent studied her for a long moment. "You stood in this room and used cruelty as a distraction." His gaze moved briefly to Grace, then back to Madison. "That tells me everything I need to know." Madison lowered her eyes. Bradley looked smaller now, not because anyone had touched him, but because truth had taken away the height money gave him. When the authorities arrived, the guests parted without being asked. The same room that had laughed at Grace now made space for consequences. Bradley was escorted out with his attorney's number on his lips and fear behind his expensive smile. Madison followed moments later, her diamonds still shining, her future no longer attached to Vincent Callahan's name. The doors closed behind them with a quiet finality. Only then did Vincent turn fully toward Grace. The broken glass had been cleared away, but the stain of what happened still seemed to hang in the air. He reached down, picked up the clean service towel that had fallen from her tray, and held it out to her with both hands. Not tossed, not handed down, offered. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of command, "I owe you my life." Grace stared at the towel, then at him. Around them, every guest watched in silence as the most feared man in Chicago honored the woman they had tried to humiliate. And in that silence, Grace felt something inside her straighten. Grace took the towel with both hands because anything less would have felt too small for the moment. The cloth was warm from the ballroom lights, soft against her fingers, impossibly ordinary after everything that had happened. A few minutes earlier, those same fingers had been trembling under the weight of the room's laughter. Now every person in that room watched her, as if they were finally seeing a human being where they had once seen only a uniform. Vincent did not move away from her. That mattered more than any apology spoken too late. He stood beside her in full view of the guests, not shielding her like a problem to hide, but honoring her like a witness the room had been forced to respect. Mrs. Porter wiped at one eye and quickly looked down, pretending to adjust the edge of Grace's sleeve. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she whispered. Grace wanted to say yes. She had survived worse nights than this one. She had survived hospital waiting rooms at 2 o'clock in the morning, eviction notices taped to apartment doors, managers who punished honesty, and customers who thought kindness came with a price tag. But something about being asked gently, in front of people who had just tried to break her, loosened the tight place inside her chest. "I do not know," Grace said softly. The honesty made her feel more exposed than fear had. Vincent heard it. His jaw tightened, not with anger at her, but with something colder aimed at the room. He turned slowly, his gaze moving over the guests who had treated Grace's humiliation as entertainment. "Every person here who laughed," he said, "will leave my home tonight knowing exactly why they are not welcome back." No one objected. A woman near the fireplace lowered her champagne glass as if it had become too heavy to hold. A man who had joked about Grace's salary stared at his shoes. Vincent continued, calm and merciless in his restraint. "You do not measure a person's worth by the door they enter through, the job they do, or the color of their skin. You measure it by what they choose when it costs them something." His eyes returned to Grace. Tonight, Miss Bennet chose courage. Grace felt tears rise, but she did not wipe them away. For once, she did not feel ashamed of them. They were not tears of weakness. They were the body's way of releasing a weight she had carried too long. Dr. Ellison stepped forward and offered her a clean chair near the wall, but Grace shook her head. Sitting would have made her look rescued. She was grateful, but she did not want to shrink anymore. "I can stand," she said. The words were quiet, but they traveled. Vincent gave the smallest nod, and something like respect passed between them, not loud, not sentimental, but solid. The staff began guiding the guests toward the exits. Coats were collected. Cars were called. The music did not return. No one asked for dessert. As the room emptied, apologies began to appear like nervous coins dropped at Grace's feet. "I am sorry. We did not understand. It all happened so fast." Grace listened, but she understood what they were really apologizing for. Not for being wrong, for being seen being wrong. When the last guest disappeared into the cold Chicago night, the mansion exhaled. The chandeliers still burned. The marble still shone. The roses still climbed the staircase. But the room felt different now, as if the walls themselves had witnessed a judgment. Vincent walked to the service table and picked up the hospital receipt that had slipped from Grace's pocket during the chaos. Marcus Bennett's name sat at the top, followed by numbers that had been haunting her for months. Grace froze when she saw it in his hand. "Please," she said quickly, pride and panic tangling in her voice. "That is private." Vincent looked at the paper, then folded it once with careful respect and handed it back to her. "You are right," he said. "It is." That simple answer struck her harder than any grand gesture could have. He had power enough to investigate her whole life by sunrise. But in that moment, he chose not to take what she had not offered. Grace held the receipt against her chest. Vincent's voice softened. "But if the reason you stayed silent in this house was because you were carrying that alone, then I need you to understand something." Grace looked up. The cold man everyone feared stood beneath golden light, his face unreadable except for the quiet certainty in his eyes. "You are not alone in my house anymore." By midnight, the Callahan mansion was almost silent. The guests were gone. The roses had begun to droop along the staircase, and the grand ballroom smelled faintly of extinguished candles and spilled champagne. Grace Bennet stood near the service entrance in her coat, her uniform folded over one arm, the hospital receipt tucked safely back into her purse. She had planned to leave without saying anything. That was what people like her did after surviving rooms like that. They cleaned up what they could, swallowed what they could not, and went home before anyone changed their mind about showing kindness. But Vincent Callahan was waiting beside the black car at the end of the drive, his suit jacket open against the cold Chicago air. "Miss Bennet," he said. Not Grace. Not Maid. Miss Bennet. The name still felt unfamiliar in his voice, like something polished and returned to her after being taken by strangers. "Your brother is at St. Anthony Medical Center?" Grace's fingers tightened around her purse strap. "I did not give you permission to look into him." Vincent nodded once, accepting the rebuke without offense. You did not. Mrs. Porter told me only the hospital name after I asked whether you had a safe ride home. Nothing more. The answer disarmed her because it did not try to own her gratitude. Grace looked toward the street, where the city lights blurred beyond the iron gate. I do not need charity, Mr. Callahan. I know. His reply came too quickly to be pity. Charity is what people give when they want to feel generous. What I owe you is a debt. The next morning, Grace walked into St. Anthony expecting the same fluorescent hallway, the same tired vending machines, the same nurse at the desk asking whether she had another partial payment. Instead, the receptionist stood when she saw her. Miss Bennett, your brother has been transferred to the cardiac care wing. Grace stopped moving. There must be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Marcus was in a private room on the 5th floor, propped against clean white pillows, a paper cup of lemon ice in his hand, looking more confused than sick for the first time in months. Gracie, he said, his voice cracking into a smile. Some woman from administration said my treatment has been covered through the foundation. Grace pressed a hand to her mouth. On the bedside table was a plain envelope with her name written in careful black ink. Inside was a short note. No speech. No demand. No reminder of what she owed. Just one line. You protected my life when no one believed you. So I protected what you love. Grace sat beside Marcus and finally cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in years. Not quietly in a supply closet, not silently over bills, not with one eye on the clock and the other on survival, but fully, with her brother's hand wrapped around hers and sunlight coming through a window wide enough to make the whole city look softer. 2 days later, she returned to the mansion, not because she had been ordered to, but because Mrs. Porter said Vincent wanted to speak with the entire staff. Everyone gathered in the ballroom, the same room where laughter had tried to bury her. Vincent stood at the front without a glass in his hand, without guests around him, without the performance of power. From this day forward, he said, any person who disrespects a member of this staff disrespects me. There will be no exceptions. His eyes found Grace for only a second, but it was enough. The rule was not charity. It was recognition. Weeks passed, and the story moved through Chicago in whispers, not as gossip about a ruined deal, but as a warning about dignity. People remembered the rich guests who laughed. They remembered the man who thought money could purchase blame. But most of all, they remembered the poor maid who stood alone beneath the chandeliers and told the truth while the whole room mocked her for it. Grace still wore her black uniform. She still polished silver and folded linen and walked the long marble halls in sensible shoes. But no one looked through her anymore. And when Vincent Callahan passed her in the corridor, he did not nod like a man acknowledging staff. He paused like a man remembering the night a woman with nothing to gain saved him from losing everything. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.